If God is good, does he really condemn people? Is there a heaven or hell that he sends people to?
I've been told that you have to pick one or the other, science or faith.
I want to learn more about the teachings of the Bible, but sometimes when I read the lessons and the stories, they just don't make sense.
Our world is full of immense suffering and huge need. If God is all loving, why does he let people suffer? Why doesn't he cure cancer or COVID or all of those other things that people face on a regular basis?
Why do bad things happen to good people?
Most of us have questions about faith. Now, of course, we probably know people who don't. Do you know anybody like that? They've got all the answers. No questions, but they have all the answers. And they're probably enthusiastic to share those answers with you. But most of us have questions about faith. Some of those questions don't really bother us that much. How old was Methuselah when he was, some questions we don't wake up thinking about. Some questions, however, are questions that affect our faith so deeply that we feel torn. We feel a sense of cognitive dissonance. Like, I don't know how seriously I can take my faith with questions like this unresolved, unanswered if they're not dealt with, especially if I'm in an environment where I'm not really allowed to express them at all. And that's where millions of self-professing Christians find themselves in the United States, in church environments where they know they're really not allowed to be intellectually honest and curious people and say certain things out loud, and they know what would happen if they do. And so we can go through life holding on to these questions, and it's not just an intellectual, brainy exercise. Because if you feel like you can't really take your faith seriously, you start to question how you live, your value system, what you've been told. Sometimes you might feel lied to by some people. Sometimes you tend to question everything, and that's a deeply emotional experience, isn't it? When you go through a time in your life where you're questioning everything. Some people call that deconstruction. There are other words that people will use. But thinking people have questions about faith. And in this series, we want to do our best to at least thoughtfully deal with them. There may not be easy answers to all of these questions. Life is complex. And there is some mystery to life, but as intellectually honest people, we want to do our best. And so here's our schedule for where we're headed over the next several weeks. Today, we're starting with the Bible, science, and thinking for yourself, using your rational mind to think. Next week, when Christians act hypocritically, how do we deal with that when we experience trauma, disappointment, hypocrisy? January 21st, making sense of the Bible. What is the Bible? How do I interpret it? January 28th, does God consign people to an eternal hell? That's a question that a lot of people have. What does it say about God? If that's the case, my loved ones, and so on. So that's an important question. February 4th, I love this title, The Strange Relationship Between Jesus and American Politics. And it is strange. Can I get an amen? And so we'll tackle, why is it that so many people seem to have this political agenda, and they use Jesus as some kind of justification for their agenda. And then February 11th, the Bible, sexuality, and abortion. And then for the end of the series, February 18th, one of the most common questions people ask, why does God allow suffering? Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Now, some of you might think, is this pastor just a glutton for punishment? Does he know what's coming when you deal with these kinds of questions in church? But truth is, I do, because this is the kind of church where we're allowed to say these things out loud. We're allowed to be intellectually honest, curious people. Our mission statement here is to create a community where thinking, compassionate people can find a spiritual home and cultivate a Jesus-inspired life. We want to follow Jesus, and we want to be intellectually honest, and we believe that those two things can coexist. And if you see titles up here that are appealing to you, or maybe you know somebody that they speak to, I want to encourage you to invite a friend and join us for this series. So today, we're starting with the Bible, science, and thinking for yourself. The last time I served as a pastor in what you would really call an evangelical church, if you know what that word means, kind of more conservative theology and what a lot of people think of when they think of Christianity in the United States. Last time I served as a pastor in a church like that was about 2005. So I'm almost 20 years removed from evangelicalism, where most of the people in the church believe in a literal 6-day creation and they doubt evolution, or at least they pretend to believe that. Whether they actually do or not, I'm not sure. But I'm removed from that by quite a few years now. So I don't personally feel the tension between the Bible and science and rational thought that I used to feel. But when I was a teenager in an evangelical environment, I thought I was in that small group of people who had all the answers, who had it all right. And I was just like, it was this programmed to think that way. How sad is it that most of the world is going to hell because they don't have the right answers like I do? That was my mentality. Maybe some of you grew up like that too, where it's just, us four and no more, we got it all figured out. Most of the world is wrong, and isn't that the way it works? You never find religious fundamentalist groups that are like, you know what, I think we're wrong and everybody else is right. That's just not quite how it plays out. It's always, we're right, everybody else is wrong, we have all the easy answers. And at the same time, as I got a little older, getting in college age, and I started to actually entertain questions, I allowed my brain, frankly, to be honest about the questions I had. I realized that, this environment's kind of insulated. We don't really allow what we believe to be questioned, and I wonder why that is. And sometimes I would meet people in that church environment who would make fun of people who had different beliefs, or almost mock them. Like, those people, they're just so blinded, They're blinded by their own sin. And we, and just ways to make ourselves feel better. And I realized, we're so insulated and defensive about having all the right answers because somewhere deep down, those who are at least somewhat honest would realize that, okay, if somebody pushes on one of these cards that are in my belief system, this whole house of cards could come tumbling down. And maybe we don't have all the right answers. And you can have experiences in life where you start to, they poke at that house of cards. And you're like, wait a minute, maybe I don't have it all figured out. But for those people who do or are told that they should, that's a lot of pressure to live with. When you are a high school student and you feel like you have to argue with your high school biology teacher about evolution and creation, or when you think everybody else around you is going to hell for all of eternity because they don't believe the idiosyncratic statement of faith on your church's website, that's a lot of pressure to live with. And I remember what that felt like. And so now, of course, there are still millions and millions of Americans who are raised in this kind of environment, or as adults are in this kind of environment where they think that, most scientists are a threat to their faith. They think that rational thought is an attack, evidence is an attack on their faith. And it's not just science. That's a big deal, but it's much larger than that. There's a certain strain of Christianity, and you don't need me to tell you this, that is popular in America that teaches people to essentially not pay attention to their rational thought. It teaches them not to ask questions. It teaches them to not value evidence. Like, using their brain is bad. And so millions of Americans seem to not have effective critical thinking skills. They have a hard time when a snake oil salesman comes along and tries to sell them a bill of goods, and they fall prey to demagogues and grifters, people who get rich lying to them and just spreading misinformation. And they believe conspiracy theories that are contradictory, even if they don't make any sense. And they're just committed to these things. And you might be in the place in life, kind of more closer to where I am now, to where you might be comfortable with the Bible and science and rational thought. But let me ask you a question. Even if that's you, is your life affected by other people's lack of critical thinking skills? Oh, it sure is. Every moment of every day, do we need to talk about what 2024 is going to look like in the United States? And the roller coaster that we're going to all be riding on because of so many people who are falling prey to propaganda, disinformation, conspiracies. And if you ask the average person what they think of Christians, especially, the more evangelical Christian variety, because that's the folks who are promoting a lot of the misinformation and conspiracies. You're going to get answers like, well, I think Christians are anti-science. I think they're anti-women. I think they're anti-gay. They believe propaganda. They fall for conspiracy theories. Some of them are white supremacist. Those are the kinds of answers that you're going to get because there are so many people who seem to have a hard time with their faith and rational thought. And so today we're talking about the relationship of the Bible and science and thinking for yourself, and we're going to try to answer questions like, can a thinking person be a Christian? Can a person who is an intelligent, thoughtful person, can they follow Jesus Christ? Can they be part of a church? Can Christians who are thinking people take their faith seriously and still value modern science and rational thinking? That's what we're going to attempt to answer today. So the main reason that so many Christians have a general distrust for modern science is the creation account in Genesis. I've given a few sermons about the Bible and science and creation. You can listen to them at our website, wellchurch.org. But Genesis chapter 1 seems to say that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. And after every day, it says there was evening and morning the first day, and it looks like a day. It looks like what we would picture as a 24-hour day. And in the 1600s, an archbishop named James Ussher counted the genealogies in the Bible. These are the begats. So if you ever try to, read the Bible in a year plan, this is like the literary quicksand where you get stuck and people just fall off the wagon when they try to read the Bible. Adam begat Cain, they begat somebody else. And so he counted the begats, and he came to believe that God created the world in 6 days, and according to his math, it was in 4004 BC. He had it down to the year. That God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days in 4004 BC. That's pretty certain, right? I mean, that's pretty confident to count it down to the year. And there are Christians who believe that that is the only biblical view of creation. If you want to be a Christian and you love the Bible and you believe somehow the Bible is inspired by God somehow, and that's a faith statement and so on, but if you want to take the Bible seriously, there are lots and lots of Christians who believe that's the only view of creation, and there isn't any other view that you could hold and still be a serious Christian. They believe that you have to accept that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, and according to my math, that would be 6,028 years ago. And that's the view you have to have. That's called young earth creationism. Now, that obviously sits in contrast with the theory of evolution, that the universe and all life in it has evolved over billions of years. The theory of evolution suggests that the universe is about 13.7 billion years old, and that the earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and that life evolved over time into their present forms. And the study of DNA, genetics, has helped us to understand that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved from our predecessors somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, depending on how you define what it means to be human. That's a question, what it means to be human. And our capacity for language developed about 50,000 years ago. So when the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists believe that the universe began 13.7 billion years ago, and then let's say you're in high school and your parents teach you to be a Christian, you have to believe that God created the world in 6 days, 6,028 years ago. Somebody's wrong. It's not like you can meet in the middle and split the difference. Let's agree to disagree. Somebody's way off there. Those two views really can't be reconciled. And so if you come from an environment where you're taught that young earth creation is the only way of valuing the Bible and believing that God created somehow, then you have to make sense of that. Why is it that 98% of scientists in the world see it differently than you do? And then that starts to feel like a threat to your faith, and you have to defend the Bible against this threat of science or rational thought or evidence or radiocarbon dating. I saw a video yesterday with Kirk Cameron talking about how dinosaurs and humans existed together. He's a 6-day creation. Did you know that? What was the show he was in? Was it Growing Pains? Okay, yeah, I saw a video of him yesterday. Just popped up on my Facebook feed, probably researching this sermon. And so Kirk Cameron popped up talking about how the earth is 6,000 years old. And so you see science as a threat, and rational thought can be a threat. And that's a lot of pressure, and you have to explain that. And so most of the world's scientists are either lying to you or it's a conspiracy. Like scientists are out to get you. They're out to undermine the Bible. They're blinded. The world is in darkness and controlled by lies. And we have the truth that the world is 6,028 years old. Everybody else is just lying, or they're out to get us. And man, it's a lot of pressure to live with. And you have to continually explain why you believe this and look for evidence, ironically, that supports your view. And so I remember being a freshman in high school, and the science teacher was also the football coach and the basketball coach. That's how it goes in a lot of schools, but especially in small schools like mine. So at the end of the day, you take off his slacks and put on his little coaching shorts, those skin-tight coaching shorts up to here, pick up his clipboard, go out. And he was a good guy, actually. He's a good teacher and a good coach. And the day he broached the topic of evolution in science class, you could tell that he was nervously trying to mitigate the damage, to minimize the number of complaints that he could get from Christian parents who were against evolution. If he said the wrong thing, that freshman was going to go home and tell their parents that, my public school is controlled by Satan. And you could tell when he was trying to introduce evolution, it was like a parent trying to have the awkward talk with their 13-year-old. Like, he just gave all these, it's kind of embarrassed and disclaimers and some people believe this is the way that only some people, some people believe differently, and he just gave disclaimer after disclaimer. And then he talked about evolution. I'm sure he had learned the hard way in the past what would happen to him in modern America if he talked about evolution just matter-of-factly. So now, I don't see science or the theory of evolution as a threat to my faith or an enemy of my faith in any way. And the reason that I don't, it's actually not because of science or evolution. I find that fascinating, but it's because of the Bible. It's because of the way I read the Bible and my view of the Scriptures that I don't see science or rational thought as a threat to my faith. In fact, when it comes to creation, the Bible gives us lots of clues that the creation accounts in Genesis do not have to be interpreted literally. That God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, 6,028 years ago. There are clues telling us that we can interpret the creation accounts differently. And notice the plural there. That perhaps there's not one creation account, but there perhaps are 2 creation accounts. And here's the first clue. All modern translations of the Bible recognize something that you can read for yourself. When you read any English translation of the Bible, you don't have to have a Bible degree to see these things, but all modern translations recognize this. Even if they're translated by publishers that are fairly conservative in their theology, they still recognize something happens between Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 and Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. So I'm going to kind of fly through this material. I want to show you some pictures. You may not be able to see these clearly, but these are just screenshots from my phone on a website, BibleGateway.com, and you can find all kinds of Bible translations on BibleGateway.com. And do you see here, even if it's tough to make out the words, can you see how there's Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, and then there's a heading on this one. The heading is Adam and Eve. And then you have Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Does everybody see that? Can you see that, at least that break on the screen? So the chapters and verses were not in the original manuscripts of the Bible. The books of the Bible were written on scrolls, which are animal skins. That's how long ago this was written. And then somebody about 100 AD got the idea, if we chop up these animal skins and bind them on one side, that's like their version of the iPhone. This is a new piece of technology here where we can flip through these without having to unroll them every time. So the chapters and verses weren't there. The headings are put there by the publishers. Whatever publishing company is translating their translation of the Bible. So they put the heading there of Adam and Eve, and there's a break between chapter 2, verse 3 and chapter 2, verse 4. That's the New International Version. Let's just go on to another photo here. The New Living Translation, they actually have the break after verse 4, and then the heading is the man and the woman in Eden. And if we go on to the English Standard Version, this is the more conservative translation, and yes, that's a thing. There are publishing companies and translation boards that have, even translation is interpretation. So they have a more conservative bent, but they still have that break between Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 and verse 4, and they really want you to focus on man and woman, that there are men and women in this conservative translation, but they still see that break that happens there. I might have one more photo. This is the New Revised Standard Version. This is the more progressive one. They have the break after, that's the New American Standard there. They have the break between 3 and 4, the heading creation of man and woman. And there's one more, I think. The New Revised Standard Version was on there somewhere. They have the break, but then their heading, their more progressive translation board, their heading is another account of creation. So the New Revised Standard Version just goes all the way and they say, here comes the second account of creation. So all that to say, no matter what the theological bent is of that particular Bible publisher, everybody knows there's a break. Somewhere in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, and verse 4, and verse 5. There's a natural break there. It's just important to notate that. Now, why is that? Again, you don't need a Bible degree to see it. If you start with Genesis chapter 1, you're going to read Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 3. And you're going to notice that the language of Genesis 1 it's almost like poetry. And in Hebrew, it's very, very close to poetry. It's almost like a song. In Hebrew, there's rhyme and alliteration and clear patterns, but in Genesis chapter 1, you see like there was evening and morning the first day. And on day 1, God said, and day 2, God said. And so that you can see the repetition in Genesis chapter 1, that it's kind of poetic. And if you were to just kind of graph it out quickly, you would see that on days 1 through 3, God creates environments, and on days 4 through 6, God fills those environments, land, water, sky. And in Hebrew poetry, that's called a heliasm. It makes an X, and that was part of Hebrew poetry. If you could read Hebrew, which I have to look up the words in a lexicon. I'm not a fluent Hebrew reader. Words are repeated in multiples of 7, 3, and 4 in Genesis chapter 1. Whoever wrote Genesis chapter 1 was obsessed with patterns and rhyme and alliteration. The person's a genius. They're like the Israelite Paul McCartney. Whoever wrote Genesis chapter 1, it's incredible. But it's different from Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 on. There are clear differences. Genesis 2:4, it's not written that way. It's a completely different style of writing. And in Genesis chapter 1, the theology is there's a God who's this big cosmic God who speaks and stars exist. The theme is that God is God everywhere, no matter what you live. In the ancient world, it was believed that the gods were territorial, like kings or queens. But Genesis 1 says, no, God is God everywhere. And so no matter where you are in the world, your God is still God. That's the theology of Genesis chapter 1. And then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 and on, that's where we encounter Adam and Eve. And the language is completely different. It's not poetic anymore. Instead of being a big cosmic God, God is portrayed as walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, just kind of hanging out. God's hanging out with Adam and Eve. They chat. God is down to earth. The language is more relaxed. And there's a different order of creation that we'll see here in a moment. And then there's another huge clue that these are actually two separate creation accounts. And so what I'm going to do is just read several verses from Genesis chapter 1. You were familiar with these, but I think I underlined some words that are important. If not, we'll emphasize those. And so let's read Genesis chapter 1 and just see how these differ. In the beginning, help me out. Who? God. That's something to notate. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. In Hebrew, that's tohu vabohu. It rhymes. There's a lot of rhyme and alliteration here. Darkness was over the first surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And who? God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and morning the first day. And God said, let there be a vault, that's interesting, between the waters to separate water from water. That's interesting, okay. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. God called the vault sky. Okay, so the sky is like a vault, and there's water below, or like a dome. You know, the sky's kind of solid. There's water below the sky, and there's water above the sky. Okay, that's interesting. And there was evening and morning the second day, and God said, let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, let the dry ground appear, and it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered the gathered waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. And verse 12 there, the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God, same name there, same God, saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning the third day. And we're going to skip to verse 26. Then God said, finally, after all of these things, let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created humankind in his own image. This is male and female. God created them, and some people point to that for a particular agenda. And verse 2:1, so here's chapter 2, verse 1. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had created, all the work he had been doing, and on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. God's like, man, I'm tired. All this work I've been doing here, I'm going to rest on the seventh day. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is familiar, correct? There's some interesting things there. But it's a familiar passage where God creates in a certain well-known order, and then the seventh day God rested. So when little Jewish boys and girls say mommy and daddy, or whoever their parents or grandparents or guardians are, why do we practice the Sabbath? Well, God rested on the seventh day, and there's lots of other profound meaning here. But let's move on to chapter 2, verse 4. Chapter 2, verse 4. This is the account. Isn't it interesting how your voice inflection can influence the way you read? Isn't that an interesting way to make a statement in the middle of something? So there are some translations that have that as the end of the last account we just read. More have it as the beginning of this one, but isn't that an interesting thing to say? If it's one creation account. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. When the, help me out, Lord God. Well, that's interesting. Interesting. Made the earth and the heavens. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the who? Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Okay, interesting. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Do you remember the order of creation that we just read in Genesis chapter 1? God creates all these things first, the sky, the land, the plants, the animals, and then humans. What's going on here? What order do we have here? There was no plant or any that had sprung up. There was no rain yet. And then God, the Lord God, creates a person before all of the vegetation. So there are several clues that point to the existence of two creation accounts. So first of all, in verse 2:4, I pointed out, it says, this is the account. That's an odd statement to put in the middle of one creation account. And then in Genesis 1, we have humans created last. Here they seem to be created first in Genesis chapter 2. And then finally, we have a new name for God in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis 1 through 2:3, God's name is God. And in Hebrew, that's Elohim. Elohim is used through chapter 1 and up to chapter 2, verse 3. And then starting in chapter 2, verse 4, God's name is Lord God. And in Hebrew, that's Adonai Elohim, which is actually a euphemism for Yahweh Elohim. They wouldn't say Yahweh. They wouldn't pronounce it because they believed it was such a holy, sacred name. So Yahweh means something like I am. When Moses encounters the burning bush, tell them I am sent you. Tell Pharaoh I am sent you, or I will be who I will be. And so you have this new name for God in Genesis 2:4. And then Lord God continues to be the name used through Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, when Adam and Eve are banned from the garden. And then starting in chapter 4, the name used is Lord only. It's only Adonai during the Cain and Abel story, except for one verse, verse 25. Genesis chapter 4 ends with the verse, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. Then in chapter 5, the genealogy from Adam to Noah, God is used alone, just like in chapter 1. Then from chapter 6 through 9, which is the Noah and the flood story, both Lord and God are used interchangeably. No names for God appear in chapter 10, and then in chapter 11, it's just Lord again during the Tower of Babel, easy for me to say, episode, just like the Cain and Abel story in chapter 4. So the name for God varies according to which episode you're reading in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Anybody else interested by that? And then in the 19th century, theologians realized this, and they started tracking these changes in the names for God throughout the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And that led to the development of several theories, because it appears that there are various traditions where there were different names for God, different views of God, and they're woven together to form Genesis. A few chapters later, you have the Noah and the flood account. We talked about this a few months ago. There are actually 2 different Noah and the flood accounts. Is it raining outside? Yeah, speaking of the flood, here we are. And so there are 2 different Noah accounts. There are different numbers for how many animals go in the ark. There are a lot of Christians who would say, no, I believe the Bible, every single word it says, and they don't know that Genesis actually gives 2 different numbers for animals that go into the ark. And of course, there are these things, these details, like the sky is like a solid dome, and there's a bunch of water above the sky. And if you don't have satellite images, that makes sense, because where does the rain come from? But that's not our understanding of the world now. It is the understanding that would work to get a worldwide flood in Noah, but that's not our understanding now of how the world works. And of course, light is created on day 1, and the sun's created on day 4. And that's interesting. That's not our view of the world, but this has an effect on how people view the world if they are raised in an environment like this as a kid or as an adult, if they come into an environment like this. The last time I served as a pastor in an evangelical church back in 2003 to 2005, there was a youth pastor there who was a friend of mine. Like, we actually got along well. We'd go out and have lunch, and my views were starting to change at that time, and sometimes we would have some discussions about that, but he led a parachurch ministry in addition to his youth pastor job, and really the main focus of his ministry was teaching what he called a biblical worldview, and that was based on young earth creationism, that God created the world in 6 literal days 6,000 years ago. And so that's the main thing he talked about in his youth ministry. And this is a church of about 500 people. And then he had a podcast when podcasts were first starting, and he would go travel to different churches and talk about how it was so important to have a biblical worldview. And he was always appealed to this, and when it says God created the male and female, it was really important to him. He pulled a lot of material out of that. And as these kids got older, it became obvious that his ministry also included a lot of right-wing politics, and definitely anti-gay. Women should not lead. And he called it worldview warriors. And again, I liked him. He's a nice guy to me, right? But worldview warriors, these were teenagers who were raised to be warriors for God, believing in 6-day creationism. And 98% of scientists in the world are they're either lying or it's a conspiracy. And God created the world in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. And that means you need to have conservative politics and a conservative view of sexuality. And he was raising the next generation of culture warriors in the United States who would turn into, in a few years, conservative Christian voters. This kind of Christianity exists all over this country. In actually most churches in the suburbs and rural areas of America. This is the kind of Christianity that you're going to most commonly encounter. Jesus wants warriors, culture warriors, soldiers who are going to go fight against the secularists and the people who believe in evolution and women's rights and gay rights, and you're going to fight them. And we're going to fight these people who are so blind to believe that we evolved. And no, because God created us 6,000 years ago, and in that world, that all makes sense. And that's how this actually works in 2024 America. We're not just talking about theology and science and biology teachers. This is how all of this works in America. This is what is going to shape 2024, and specifically November of 2024. And there are people who sincerely believe that in order to be a Christian, they have to accept all of these things. And by the way, in chapter 3, there's a talking snake. So there are people who believe they have to argue with their high school biology teacher. Almost all scientists are in opposition against them. It's a conspiracy, or they're all lying, and we need to vote this way, and God sees the world this way, and this is a biblical worldview, and this is the way you need to view it if you want to be a Christian. And by the way, there's a talking snake in the story. And that evidence is, you're just taught to ignore that and not question that. Well, which brings me to the Bible and thinking for yourself and rational thought. This is about much more than science. It's about whether you're allowed to think for yourself. God gave you a brain. Are you allowed to use it? Are you allowed to think? Are you allowed to be intellectually honest? Are you allowed to be an honest, curious person? Not somebody who's necessarily an iconoclast and you just want to rip it all down, but can you at least be honest about your questions? Does God expect you to deny that ability in order to have faith? Does faith mean that you're not allowed to think? You have to have blind faith. You just believe with no evidence, nothing at all. So church leaders throughout history and Jewish leaders before there was a Christianity have acknowledged the problem with an overly literal reading of Genesis, which is the source of so much of this questioning of science and rational thought. And they had allowed the use of their minds and to try to figure out what they believe. And I'll give you a few examples of this, and this is not exhaustive. But if you've been in a church environment where you weren't allowed to question anything, you just take it on blind faith, well, this is what some of the most influential Christian and Jewish leaders in history had to say about that, specifically about these passages we've read. Here's the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who was born maybe just a couple of decades before Jesus. He wrote in On Allegory that the 6 days of creation were figurative. It is quite foolish to think that the world was created in 6 days or in a space of time at all, pardon the type of the created in 6 days or in the space of time at all. Why? Because every period of time is a series of days and nights, and these can only be made such by the movement of the sun as it goes over and under the earth. So he had an earth-centric view, but he understood, okay, a day is like the sun down and sun up. But the sun is a part of heaven, so that time is confessedly more recent than the world, and it would therefore be correct to say that the world was not made in time, but that time was formed by means of the world. For it was heaven's movement that was the index of the nature of time. Do you follow Philo there? He's saying 6 days of creation, there was no sun yet. The sun's created on day 4. There's no day without the sun. And so we don't, and then no, the author of Genesis 1 wasn't stupid. The author of Genesis 1 is a literary genius. He's just saying these are figurative. These aren't literal days. They're figurative. And he also saw the seventh day as justifying the Sabbath, which I think is fairly obvious. And then Irenaeus of Lyon was an early church leader in the late 100s AD, so not long after Jesus and the apostles. And he cited 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 in the New Testament, that a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years. And so he read day in Genesis 1 as each day being 1,000 years. And so God took 6,000 years, to create. Now, obviously, we hold a different view than that, but he viewed the day as figurative, that no, God didn't create the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. Clement of Alexandria, another church leader who lived just a generation after Irenaeus, held the same interpretation, that it's not 6 literal 24-hour days. He saw problems with that view of creation. A contemporary leader, Justin Martyr, appears to have held a similar belief. And then one of the most influential Christians in history, Augustine, also rejected a 6 literal day of creation narrative. He served as a bishop in the 400s AD, and his commentary entitled The Literal Meaning of Genesis In 415 AD, he writes, "It not infrequently happens that something about the earth, about the sky, about other elements of this world may be known with the greatest certainty by reasoning, using your brain, or experience, even by one who is not a Christian. It is too disgraceful and ruinous, though, and greatly to be avoided, that he, the non-Christian, should hear a Christian speaking so idiotically on these matters." His word, not mine. This is Augustine in the 400s. This is 1400 years before Charles Darwin. As if in accord with the Christian's writing, that he might say that he could scarcely keep from laughing when he saw how totally in error they are with the Scriptures is a matter of treating about the faith. For that reason, as I've noted repeatedly, if anyone not understanding the mode of divine eloquence should find something about these matters, about the physical universe in our books, or hear of the same from those books, of such a kind that it seems to be at variance with the perceptions of his own rational faculties, let him believe that these other things are in no way necessary to the admonitions or accounts or predictions of the Scriptures. In short, it must be said that our authors knew the truth about the nature of the skies, but it was not the intention of the Spirit of God who spoke through them to teach men anything that would not be useful to them for their salvation. Is that a shocker to anybody? One of the most influential theologians in Christian history said, you can use your brain, and the Scriptures are meant to teach us about salvation and our relationship with God. They're not science books. And you don't have to deny your rational faculties and argue that Genesis 1 is literal in order to be a Christian. One last quote, and this might be a shock to some. All modern Baptists are going to trace their theological lineage to John Calvin, who's the creator of Calvinism, the theological system called Calvinism. Calvin held a nuanced view of creation. He seemed to believe in a six-day creation, but he also acknowledged that we would not reject science based on an overly literal reading of Genesis. And this comes from his commentary on Genesis. This is chapter 1, verse 6 in 1554. It's kind of dense language, but you can follow it. For it appears opposed to common sense and quite incredible that there should be waters above the heaven. Hence, some resort to allegory, which is non-literal, and philosophize concerning angels, but quite beside the purpose. For to my mind, this is a certain principle that nothing is here treated of but the visible form of the world. He who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts, recondite, complex, difficult to understand, astronomy, right? The sciences, quantum physics, etc. in our day. Let him go elsewhere. In other words, the Scriptures are not what you're going to look to if you want to understand astronomy. If you're Neil deGrasse Tyson, Genesis 1 isn't going to help you. The Webb telescopes and the Hubble telescopes, those are going to help you. This is John Calvin. Whence I conclude that the waters here meant are such as the rude and unlearned may perceive. The assertion of some that they embrace by faith what they have read concerning the waters above the heavens. Remember, there's this dome in Genesis 1 with the waters above. Notwithstanding their ignorance respecting them, is not in accordance with the design of Moses. So you follow his language there. Genesis is not a science book. People who want to learn science or the recondite arts, things that are complicated and hard to understand, they're going to go elsewhere. That's not what Genesis 1 is. That's John Calvin. That's Calvinism. That's 5-point Calvinism. People appeal to John Calvin, who many of them now would be six-day creationists, and Calvin didn't believe that. The scientist who proposed the Big Bang was a Catholic priest in Belgium named George Lemaitre. The head of the Human Genome Project was an evangelical Christian named Francis Collins. Just a few years ago, I saw him give a speech in Manhattan, in the middle of New York, where he said, this is an evangelical Christian, Francis Collins. He was appointed by George W. Bush. He said that the study of DNA essentially proves evolution. He said to him, people still call it a theory, but DNA proves that. And he remains an evangelical Christian who loves the Bible and reads the Bible. So the idea that young earth creation is the only biblical view ignores Jewish history and Christian history. Which brings me to this final point. I'm going to wrap it up here in the next couple minutes. Appreciate your patience. I know we're getting to 11 o'clock here. But when it comes to the Bible and your ability to think for yourself, to ask questions, to be intellectually honest, here's what it all comes down to. I'm going to show you a 3-minute video of a Bible scholar named Pete Enns. Many of you here are probably already familiar with Pete. He's a prolific author. He leads a podcast called The Bible for Normal People, which is a great title. We had Pete as a guest speaker when we were online only back during the COVID lockdown. And this is a video that he put on Facebook. And so I didn't have any way of copying it, to show it. I literally put my phone up to my computer and videoed the video. I'm like, there's no way I'm not going to show this in my sermon. So pardon the audio quality or video quality if it's bad, but you'll get the message. And he sums it up here perfectly. All right, let's watch this 3-minute video of Pete Enns.
If you want your life to be blessed, put yourself under the authority of the Word. That's where God commands His blessings.
Hey folks, if you have a minute, just a couple of comments I'd like to make on what you've just seen here. This rhetoric about the Bible sort of being this thing that is either over you and you're in submission to it, or it's under you and you're standing on top of it in judgment, as if those are the two options. And there are really some very serious problems with this, and one of which is it ignores what scholars will sometimes call the hermeneutical problem, the fact that the Bible really has to be interpreted. There's no such thing as a Bible that just sits there. It has to be understood. It has to be interpreted. How do I know that? I don't know, 2,500 years of Jewish interpretation and then 2,000 years of Christian interpretation. My proof is history. The world of thought, the history of thought. This is how it's always been. To think of the Bible as just this thing that is immovable and you just have to conform to it or be in judgment to it, ignores the fact that people have to interpret it and they come to different conclusions sometimes. Here's the real problem with this rhetoric. When someone says to you, you have to be under the Bible, what they mean by that is that you have to be under their understanding of the Bible. That's the part they don't tell you. For example, if you were to say something in certain church contexts, like, I know the Bible talks about 6 days of creation, but I don't know. I'm looking at things like cosmology and geology, and it just seems like, the cosmos is much older and the earth is much older than the Bible presumes. You will be accused very quickly of standing on top of the Bible in judgment rather than standing under it in submission. Again, you'd be standing under an assumption that people are making, which is that Genesis chapter 1 is to be taken literally, right? That's already an interpretation, folks. Reading this literally is an interpretation. It's not what the Bible plainly says. It is an interpretation. It is something that's brought into the biblical text. It's not just like normal Bible reading. You see, there's always going to be interpretation going on. Or in other examples, you see gospel stories that they're the same story, but boy, do they tell that story differently, like the resurrection accounts, for example, right? Well, pointing that out and saying, I wonder what's going on here. I wonder how much of this is historical. I wonder how much of it is the rhetoric of the writers at the time trying to get their point across, blah, blah, blah. See, you'll be accused very quickly of standing on top of the Bible in judgment when you're doing nothing of the sort. You're trying to understand it. You're actually joining hands with 2,500 years of Jewish and then the last 2,000 years of Christian interpretation of the Bible. It takes work. And to put this whole thing as just the Bible's up there floating around and it's down here and you have the choice to stand on top of it or stand under it, that's bogus. And what that does is it actually drives people away from a mature understanding of the Christian faith and certainly of the Scriptures.
I love that quote that many of you have experienced in your life. When someone says to you, you have to be under the Bible, what they mean is you have to be under their understanding of the Bible. That's the part they don't tell you. I love the Bible. I give sermons from the Bible every week here, really long sermons from the Bible every week. And that quote is something that if you're struggling with the Bible, science, or just your rational thought, or some of the disinformation you're going to hear this year from sources who may call themselves Christians, or if you felt the judgment of other people telling you don't believe the right things, this is the key to remember. The Bible must be interpreted. And when somebody says, well, you're not following blah, 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 what they're saying is you're not following their interpretation. But you're allowed to think for yourself. Your ability to think is part of God's image in you. Remember that verse we read in Genesis 1? Let's create human beings in our image and our likeness. Your ability to think is part of God's image in you. Adam and Eve can talk with God. They can communicate. They can think. That's part of God's image. God has created you with this brain, with rational thought, and you are certainly able to use them. I'm going to close with a story real quick. A friend of mine was the guy throughout his 20s and early 30s that never found a woman who was good enough to marry. He was always dating around, but there was some small detailed flaw, some imperfection in her that would prevent him from getting serious with her. If you have friends like that, there's always some little thing. And he wanted to get married eventually and have kids, but in his 30s, he started to think it would never happen. And he either read this in the Bible or he heard it in a sermon, I can't remember which, but it's the verse Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. It's not on the screen, but I'm going to read it for you. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." It's a famous verse. And he grew up the same way I did, where that verse is used to say, well, trust in the Lord, lean not on your understanding. Don't think. Don't ask any questions. You think too much. Just trust in the Lord. And that was the version of that, of the faith that he had been taught using that verse. Don't think for yourself. And he shared with me, he realized in his 30s, that this verse is part of the book of Proverbs, which is wisdom literature. It's about how to live well, how to make good decisions. It's the opposite of not using your brain. Proverbs, no, use your brain, think, but trust God, which means trust that God's way is best for you. Trust that it's going to work out. Doesn't mean everything in life is going to go well, but God brings good even out of pain. And if you trust God, it's a personal relationship. You trust God and do the right thing, it's going to be all right. Trust God with your life. But you can still think. It's not telling you not to think. And so he said that verse became really important to him. Now, within a few days of him reading this verse or hearing it and realizing, I'm going to trust God, and it gave him peace, and he wasn't so worried about meeting the right person. You know what's about to happen in this story? A few days later, he met this young woman, and they started to talk, and he asked her out. And they went out on a date, and they were talking. They're both Christians, and they're talking about their faith, and without him saying anything, she said, one of the verses that's been really important to me lately is Proverbs 3, 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your paths. And she said, it just gives me a lot of peace. I know I can trust God. Things are going to work out, and I'm just not stressed about what's going on in my life or what I want and that kind of thing. I'm going to trust God that it's all going to be okay. That's like the Christian version of Dreamweaver. I believe you can get, so the rest of that date went well. They dated, they got married, they have a couple of kids now. I officiated their wedding. And what that verse meant to them was not stop using your brain, stop asking questions. But what you do, if you want to follow Jesus, is you trust Jesus, that Jesus gives us the best way to live, and you put one foot in front of another, and you trust that it's going to be okay, no matter what you're facing in life. That's what that verse means. And God's going to bring good out of any situation, no matter what you're facing. And God's going to cause things to work out the best it possibly can in the real world. That verse doesn't mean blind faith, stop thinking, don't ask questions. It means to trust God, and it's going to work out. And that's the same for you and I when it comes to science and rational thought, and your ability to think is a part of God's image in you. And I invite you to pull out this communion cup that you have, and I appreciate your patience and a long sermon here. But on the night Jesus was betrayed, he shared a meal with his disciples, and he broke bread. He thanked God for it, and he said, "This is my body broken for you." It doesn't mean everything in life's easy. Sometimes you experience enormous pain in life. But he said, "This is my body broken for you. As often as you eat it, remember me." Let's eat of the bread. The same way he took the cup and he thanked God for it. And he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant shed for the forgiveness of sins. As often as you drink it, remember me." And it doesn't mean that everything in life's going to work out for you all the time. Sometimes life is bloody. But Jesus did this to accomplish his goal, and God brought good out of that. And it's going to be the same way in your life. So let's drink from the cup. I invite you to pray. Oh God, thank you that the God who created us in some mysterious way, whatever that looks like, created us with the brains that we have and the faculties of reason that we have. The ability to think, the ability to look for evidence, the ability to categorize. Adam named all the animals in Genesis 2 and 3. There's order to creation in Genesis 1. That's the foundation of science, is that things can be ordered and categorized, that we can think rationally, we can make a hypothesis, we can test it, we can experiment, we can form theories. The same rational faculties that enabled us to drive here this morning or to turn on our computer, we're allowed to use those when it comes to our faith. And faith doesn't mean acting like there's no questions, not using your brain. Some things we hold in tension, some answers we don't have. But like my friends, faith means trust in you. That following Jesus in this way of even being broken and bloodied, and knowing that's what life brings, but trusting that you're going to bring good out of that. That's what faith means. It doesn't mean blind faith and ignorance and never asking questions. It means trust. Trust in you, the one who has created us with our abilities to think and reason, and it's a part of the image of your image in us. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Everybody said, amen.